Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been meeting and mixing with world leaders all week to discuss the economy and the war in Ukraine. But one extraordinary encounter is getting more attention than others. A heated exchange between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Trudeau, where the Chinese leader accuses the Prime Minister of leaking the details of a previous conversation to the media.
If there is sincerity on your part,
free and open and frank dialogue, and that is what we will continue to have. We will continue to look to work constructively together, but there will be things we will disagree on, and we will have to.
Let's create the conditions first.
So how is this interaction being viewed by Canadians? What does it tell us about the relationship between China and Canada? Let's bring in at issue Chantal Hebert, Althia and Andrew Coyne. Elamin is away this week. Good to see everybody. Appreciate you being here. I don't think we usually get to see those kinds of encounters. So big kudos to the camera, the Canadian cameraman that caught it and was able to show it to us. Chantal, what do you make of that interaction and what that tells us, if anything, about the relationship between Canada and China?
Not to take any credit away from the cameraman who caught it, it looked like a moment that the Chinese president wanted to get caught. Whether it achieved the aims of the Chinese president remains to be seen. But clearly, in the hallway conversation that the Prime Minister had with Xi the day before, he managed to get under the skin of China and the Chinese president by raising electoral interference, as he should, by the way. Mm-hmm. I think what got the Chinese president going, or what triggered this, was not so much that Justin Trudeau related his part of the conversation. Whatever the PMO issued about that did not give you the answers. No. But it was all the international headlines that Trudeau got for that first encounter. What it tells you, is that Canada and China are not going to have a very workable relationship going forward, or at least until Justin Trudeau is no longer Prime Minister, and probably beyond that. And second, to the reaction in Canada, you have to ask yourself before you conclude that this is Justin Trudeau's doing, whether the test of his success would be to earn the approval of a dictator.
Andrew.
It's not entirely unusual for Chinese leaders to behave in an arrogant and contemptuous fashion towards Canadian leaders. Recall that when Stephen Harper was on a visit to China in 2009, he was upbraided by the Chinese premier at the time for not having visited sooner. That's right. And what was unusual, or perhaps different at that time, was at that time everybody rushed to take China's side of it. The Prime Minister was attacked in Canada for having not taken seriously the relationship enough. Mm-hmm. Well, we're in very different times now, and it's much more to your political advantage to be seen to be offside with the Chinese leadership. I could somewhat understand Mr. Xi's irritation at that bilateral meeting having basically been used for public consumption. Not that that would be terribly unusual, and not that he didn't have lots of grounds to be attacked and criticized by the Prime Minister. But I think it was more important for the Prime Minister to be seen to be standing up at the situation, because he'd done so signally little on this file before that. Remember, he was briefed about this alleged interference plot with the 11 candidates who were reportedly funded by the Chinese government in the 2019 election. He was briefed on this in January. What has been done, or what has been told to the public since then, is very little, it would seem. Mm-hmm. And so everybody's very excited about this particular meeting. And frankly, I think that's the Prime Minister's advantage, for people to be focused on that and not on what he did or didn't do in the 11 months since he first found out about this plot.
Althia.
I think how you feel about this encounter seems to be decided by whether or not you like Justin Trudeau, because judging by the columns that have been written on this, whether it was a show of weakness or a show of strength, this seems to be determined by that. I would say I'm kind of in the middle. I agree with Chantal in terms of I think the question that needs to be asked is, why is this happening, and why is it happening in front of the television cameras? This was shot by a Canadian pool. It's very clear that the president is aware of the camera. And so, again, just like leak that isn't really a leak, that is an official statement from the Prime Minister's office that says, what is the result of my bilateral discussion, which frankly we get with any leader. And often they disagree, right? Like if you get a readout from the Prime Minister's office about a call with President Biden, it's very different than the readouts of the White House issues about the call with Justin Trudeau, because they're all playing to their domestic audience about the issues that matter locally. And the Chinese are not stupid. They know that this was not a leak. I think it sounded more like a manufactured decision to kind of give the Prime Minister a dressing down. That said, I think he handled it as best as one can. And I actually thought it ended on a rather positive note, like, oh, well, let's create the conditions so that, it wasn't a let's close off dialogue. So for all the kind of grandstanding of the last week about, warning Canadian businesses about geopolitical risks about investing in China and shifting our foreign policy towards the Asia Pacific and business investments in the government's mind away from China, I think this was actually not that bad at all.
Chantal, did you have something to say? Yeah, go.
Well, let's agree. We're talking about a country that held hostage 2 Canadians for a lengthy period of time. We're not talking about people playing by the rules here. So the notion that if you like Justin Trudeau, he did okay, and if you didn't, well, he did something that got him, that had him chastised by the Chinese president, is a bit difficult to explain, but I think over the long run, it does speak to the loss of innocence of this government towards China. And that comes late in the game.
Let's remember, too, that it comes at... Yeah, go ahead, Andrew. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it comes very late in the game. Again, the question is not what did the Prime Minister say and how did he stand in that meeting. It's what is he going to do, what are we going to do about this very alarming degree of Chinese infiltration that's being increasingly revealed in reporting recently. So in terms of funding, fake candidates in the election, in terms of planting people in MPs' offices, in terms of harassing and intimidating MPs who vote against perceived Chinese interests, spreading false lies about them as being anti-Chinese bigots. This is serious business. We are under assault, basically. Our democracy is under attack by a very large and menacing power that has no compunction about doing it and is not terribly worried about what people think about them if they do, as President Xi's demeanor certainly conveyed in that meeting.
And to Andrew's point, those safeguards that were supposed to exist during the election, that committee of senior public servants that was supposed to warn us if there was electoral interference, nobody did anything. So clearly the system that they set up did not work.
Chantal?
Imagine if Justin Trudeau had managed to go to this summit, the next one, APEC, where he is now, and had managed to not talk to the Chinese president about all this, what the headlines would be about.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, it was just a day before that encounter that he was being questioned about why he couldn't get or why he didn't have a bilateral meeting with Xi Jinping. So in some ways, this was kind of a response to that. And I think that's kind of interesting to put those two thoughts up against each other. The inquiry into the Emergencies Act has been hearing from top officials this week, including the top Mountie, the top bureaucrat at finance, and the security advisor to the Prime Minister. RCMP Commissioner Lucki used her testimony in part to call for more oversight between police and politicians.
I think it's time that we put something to writing that outlines what you can and cannot do from both the commissioner's perspective and the politicians.
This call for oversight comes after claims of political interference were directed at the commissioner. So what else might come out of the inquiry in terms of possible changes, and what might we hear when Trudeau and other ministers appear next week? Okay, let's bring back at issue Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. Elamin, as I said, is away. Althia, why don't you start here? Because it's interesting that the commissioner thinks that there needs to be something, some layer of something between her and the politicians. And this is after, I think, a number of suggestions that there was political interference thrown at her and the way she handles things. What did you make of that?
Or from the minister's office in her direction. Yeah, it all actually doesn't stem from the Public Emergency Order Commission, the one that's looking at the Emergencies Act, but rather from the Nova Scotia Mass Casualty Commission. So her testimony a little while ago in those audio tapes that I think came out last month, at least several weeks ago, where it does seem like she has promised something to the minister's office, and that created a big kerfuffle back in June. So it is interesting that she is bringing this up in the inquiry for the Emergencies Act. I feel like what we're really witnessing is a whole bunch of subplots in government addressing themselves on the floor of the inquiry. To me, what has been most interesting, rather than Brenda Lucki saying that she wants a separation or clear guidance between what a commissioner can do and what is appropriate suggestion from the minister's office, is how it was that the commissioner of the RCMP did not advise cabinet when given a chance, standing in the room, to say, hey, by the way, police have a plan and they're using the tools that already exist. We do not need the Emergencies Act because a plan is afoot. The fact that she did not say that on the eve and at the time where the government is discussing whether or not to invoke the Emergencies Act, that she did not say that. I do not know how the government can continue to have faith in the RCMP commissioner.
Well, and also that they had been talking about a plan, but there was no evidence of what the plan was or how it was going to work. So it does seem,
for the week before, but now that it's finalized, it's signed off, it's ready to be deployed, that she wouldn't tell her political masters who are going to use something else because they think that there is no plan, that she wouldn't tell them that there is a plan. It's mind-boggling.
Chantal.
To me, this call for guidance, etc., is a diversion. I agree with Althia. It's a diversion from the more central question of if you are on the line to a cabinet meeting, you're not there to take notes. And if you have something that is really important to say, you find a way to say it. We find ways to say what we need to say on this panel. There are many ways to get heard. I don't believe that she suffers from an excess of shyness. No. And I don't believe that the cabinet would not have wanted to hear whatever she had to say. But what is increasingly becoming clear is that, yes, there is no longer any confidence from the government in this commissioner. And as it happens, she does not have any party on the opposition benches to defend her. So I think what we're seeing are the last months of this particular commissioner.
Andrew?
I have no objection whatever to there being greater structural separation between the Commissioner of the RCMP and the Prime Minister's office, clearer guidelines, more transparency, whatever. Remember, this is an issue that goes back many years. In the Chrétien era, for example, there was a lot of concern that the RCMP Commissioner was altogether too close to the Prime Minister, if not too cozy. And with this commissioner, there's also been questions. Now, whether these are problems of a lack of structural separation or just the character and conduct of the individuals involved is an interesting question. And in the present commissioner's case, it's an interesting question whether she's been facing pressure from above, which I would not put past them for 1 second, or whether she's been managing up or some combination of the two. So it's not just in the Nova Scotia case where she was strangely eager to advance government legislation, potentially at the cost of compromising the integrity of the investigation. But also we heard testimony in the Emergencies Inquiry where she was messaging back and forth with the commissioner of the OPP saying, well, maybe the OPP could give retroactively give the government cover on this by declaring they needed the Emergencies Act. Maybe that's not unusual, but it's certainly improper, it seems to me, for her to be that degree of political. It may all be moot, as my colleagues are suggesting, that the separation that may occur between her and her job may be the thing that results in this case. But it's a legitimate issue, is the degree to which either commissioners are managing up or cabinet ministers are managing down, but that there's altogether too much back and forth between them going on.
So very quickly, and certainly we'll talk about it next week, what do you think this needs to lead to next week when we start to hear from the politicians, the cabinet ministers, and eventually the Prime Minister, Althia?
Well, to me, what's interesting is that, on the face of it, the government doesn't meet the threshold for invoking the Emergencies Act. It doesn't, CSIS doesn't believe that it meets the threshold based on its own act. And what we've learned today, actually, is that the government has a different legal opinion. So the government is going to be presenting an original argument as to why it needed to invoke the Emergencies Act and why a broader definition of a threat met a new threshold. I think that will be interesting to hear.
Chantal?
I happen to think that the various police forces, including the RCMP, have kind of laid a foundation for the government's argument. It is not a strictly just legal argument. It is a situational argument. And everything we've heard over the first weeks kind of spoke of disarray, absence of plan, or amazing discretion on the part of the police forces when it comes to informing cabinet of having an actual plan.
Andrew?
We've heard a welter of conflicting testimony. I mean, the CSIS didn't think there was a national security emergency. The Prime Minister's National Security Advisor did. We heard testimony about threats that were perceived, but were these threats that were sufficient to cause amount to an emergency? We've had police forces fighting with the civilian authority, fighting with other police forces. You certainly get a picture of complete disarray amongst all the characters involved, which may have contributed to the final decision to invoke the act. But it's certainly going to be useful and interesting to hear from the ministers themselves about, I'm assuming they're going to testify honestly about what was going through their head at the time and how they perceived it and what was their honest belief at the time. Whether that's sufficient to justify it, of course, is another matter.
Yeah, and whether they'll get into what those conversations were around the cabinet table, I don't know. Quickly, Althia.
Well, I was just going to say, they said a lot of things publicly that we have found out are not actually true. So it will be interesting to see how they defend some of the public comments that they made to justify their use of the Emergencies Act.
Okay, and so we'll talk about that all next week. You guys can already start your homework for next week. Thank you. Appreciate you being here.